I'm frequently invited to give a lecture on a subject of my own choosing. Rather less frequently, I feel I cannot refuse, and then the problem is to find a subject for the lecture. I'm not a philosopher as such, but I suppose I've been a spectator of a rather wider range of human activities than most, and when the need to compose such a lecture arises, it provides me with an opportunity to explore in greater detail some subject of general interest that has attracted my attention. The 3 pieces I've recorded on this tape were included in a book called A Question of Balance. Rather than trim down all the chapters of the book in order to make them fit into these 2 cassettes, I thought it'd be better to record 3 of the chapters or lectures in full. I've recorded them in the order in which they were originally delivered. The 3 pieces were chosen because each one deals with a particular aspect of conflict. The first was the 1979 Reed Lecture, which I gave in the Senate House as Chancellor of the University of Cambridge. I gave it the title Philosophy, Politics, Administration. And it came about because in February and March of that year, I accompanied the Queen on a series of visits to most of the countries of the Arabian Peninsula. And following that, I went off on my own to Moscow in my capacity as President of the International Equestrian Federation to discuss preparations for the equestrian events at the Olympic Games in 1980. Then, changing my hat again, this time to that of President of the Central Council of Physical Recreation, I joined the delegation from that body to a series of meetings with the DSB, the German Sports Federation, before finally returning to London. For anyone interested in systems and theories of government, the contrasts provided by this series of visits illustrated most vividly several of the underlying factors in the ideological warfare that seems to be bedeviling so much of present-day international and community relations. The tour might well have been a practical course in the comparative study of government. Society in the Arabian states is deeply influenced by Islam, which is a strict system focused on the belief and behavior of the individual. The Sharia law deals with individual behavior in great detail and even lays down rules about dress, primarily designed to ensure that there should be no ostentatious public display of wealth, particularly in the mosque, and to impress upon its followers their absolute equality in the eyes of the Almighty. But virtually nothing is said about how the temporal government should be organized. An Islamic state, therefore, merely means that the Quranic laws of belief and behavior will be enforced. This, I believe, goes some way to explain why Islam can be the officially adopted philosophy in so many countries with very different forms of temporal government. The system which exists in Arabia is therefore a combination of Islam with the social forms and customs evolved by a largely desert and nomadic people. And it was particularly interesting to see the way in which a governing system developed for an entirely different lifestyle was coping with the challenge of sudden massive wealth and industrialization. At first sight, the system appears to be authoritarian, but this is an illusion enhanced by the Islamic teaching of respect for seniority, which is observed in a formal and social sense, rather than as a reflection of power and influence. Conversely, observance of the Islamic teaching of brotherhood and equality before God is less obvious, but plays a very important part in decision-making. In practice, dictatorship does not exist in the accepted sense in the Arabian countries, and indeed, provided Arab custom is allied to Islamic precept, it would be very difficult to achieve. The reason for this is an institution known as the Majlis, or sometimes the Diwan. The word Majlis is derived from the Arabic verb meaning to sit, so that it can be said to be a sitting. The nearest equivalent in social and political terms might be the courts of medieval European monarchs. In the Arabian system, anyone of any importance politically, socially, or tribally is expected by custom to hold a majlis open to anyone who feels inclined to attend. Those with tribal responsibilities will be visited by anyone with something to discuss, usually in the evenings, while at the top end of a pyramid of such meetings is the majlis of senior government officials and ministers. The ruler may spend as much as 4 to 6 hours a day in a series of sessions of his own majlis, with every one of his subjects is entitled to attend, and to state his business or complaint. A form of majlis also operates in the business world, and men of importance spend part of each day holding open house to their colleagues in their offices. The system also functions in reverse, in that if the ruler and his government want to introduce some piece of legislation, the proposal is floated at the Majlis and will then find its way to discussion by every interested party before reactions, objections, or approval find their way back to the ruler. It may bear little relation to a formal parliamentary system, but there's no doubt that it provides very effectively for participation in decision-making. The Gulf states have been trading and commercial communities for many years, and they've all been exposed to what we describe as Western culture, and several of them had in fact attempted a parliamentary system at various times. But owing to the pressures of vested interests, foreign embassies, and international political groups, the experiments were not exactly successful. And strangely enough, the very men who were elected members of those assemblies, and whose behaviour in them brought about their collapse, seem to be working happily and effectively through the Majlis system. However, this system has only been expected to work with a relatively small population. Whether it can remain effective under future conditions, and particularly whether it can cope with a growing industrial population, remains to be seen. From Oman, I flew to Moscow with a night stop in Istanbul, and although my visit to Moscow was totally non-political in every sense of the word, it was naturally impossible not to be conscious of a quantum shift in the intellectual environment. But there was certainly no shift in the kindly and hospitable behaviour of my hosts of the organising committee for the Olympic Games. The pervasive atmosphere of the communist system, derived from Marxist philosophy, was as strong in Moscow as the Islamic influence was apparent in Arabia. It's almost impossible to put this atmosphere into words without appearing to have some political bias. Suffice it to say that under a system which suppresses a free market intentionally and free expression of necessity, and where the responsibility for planning and execution of any project, from housing to manufacture, is vested in a Department of State, the consequences are fairly evident. Needless to say, there is not much evidence to support Marx's prediction that the interference of the state power in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another and then ceases to exist. The state is not abolished, it withers away. I did not visit any museums in Moscow, but I'm pretty certain that the Soviet state, at least, is not in a museum of antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe, where Engels expected it to be by now. Bakunin, the anarchist prophet, was rather nearer the mark when he said, "The terms scientific socialist and scientific socialism are sufficient to prove that the so-called people's state will be nothing but a despotism over the masses, exercised by a new and quite small aristocracy of real or bogus scientists. The people will be completely exempted from the task of governing and will be forced into the herd of the governed." After about 2.5 days in the capital of what has now become an immense empire, I flew on to Frankfurt in the German Federal Republic, a country with deep folk memories of the roaring inflation after the First World War and the traumatic experience of dictatorship and defeat under Hitler and his National Socialist German Workers' Party. Today, it's probably the most materially successful of all the non-communist European countries, and considering the difficulties of achieving rational and consistent policies under a parliamentary and federal structure, there is every indication of a well-organized political and administrative system. If you just read about theories of government and commentaries on economic issues, it's very easy to get the false impression that all men throughout the world are exactly alike in attitude, outlook, and talent, and that all their problems have the same cause and can be solved in the same way. Indeed, any suggestion that differences in character and aptitudes might exist is taken to mean that one or other of the many races of Homo sapiens is superior to another. This completely distorts the picture because superiority or inferiority is a matter of prejudice or opinion, while differences are matters of fact. Now, this series of visits made it quite clear to me that while there are obvious differences in system and structure, there are equally obvious differences in character and outlook between the people of the countries I visited. Yet whatever the differences in resources, geography, or national characteristics, All human communities, large and small, need some method, whether formal or informal, structured or flexible, for the purpose of managing their communal activities. While it is difficult to be objective and dangerous to generalize, I think it might be said that the difference between the systems could be measured by the amount of liberty that individuals are required to sacrifice for the sake of the system. Much as people value their liberty and independence, it seems to be generally acknowledged that some of this liberty has to be sacrificed in the interests of the community as a whole. The argument is about how much needs to be sacrificed and for what purpose. There is, of course, a significant difference between liberties given up voluntarily, that is, by a process of democratic consensus, and those which are forcibly removed. As Thomas Jefferson said, I would rather be exposed to the inconveniences attending too much liberty than those attending too small a degree of it. Supporters of the democratic principle naturally believe that theirs is the only system capable of achieving a consensus. However, a formal representative system cannot guarantee that a community will be governed by consensus any more than efficient administration can be guaranteed by the sheer size of a bureaucracy. Furthermore, both the political decision-making system and the administrative structure are deeply influenced in one way or another by the religious, philosophical, or economic concepts generally accepted by the majority or enforced by the most powerful group within the community. Therefore, any system of government comprises, in very broad terms, these three factors. First, a common purpose or a generally accepted religious or political philosophy. Second, a system of policy making. And third, an executive or administrative structure capable of implementing policy decisions. Now, I want to discuss the relationship of these three factors to each other and their influence on the community as a whole. The evidence of history seems to suggest that when these three factors, which for simplicity rather than absolute accuracy I would like to describe as philosophy, politics and administration, then these three are in balance, the general way of life appears to be more tolerant and capable of greater social and material progress. If by chance the system gets out of balance and any one of the factors comes to acquire a dominating influence or a position of exceptional power, the system becomes intolerant and inflexible, and both the institutions within the state and particularly the individual citizen are made to suffer. For example, the more powerful and aggressive the philosophy, the fewer options are open to politicians, institutions, and individuals. Alternatively, if the political factor takes the shape of a one-party state or a parliament dominated for many years by one party, the code of morality and ethics, normally supplied by the religious philosophy, is liable to be ignored, and once again it is the individual who suffers, as political ends are made to justify administrative means. Whether the element of philosophy is deliberately suppressed or removed by changing fashion, or in the case of Hitler's government, where the philosophy of Nietzsche was used to justify rather than to inspire its activities, the consequences are much the same. The politicians and administrators are left to organize things to suit themselves. Historically, battles have been between over-powerful executives or theocracies challenged by democratic political parties. It can happen, but it is less common for the professional administrators on their own to achieve such a position of power and influence within the state that it becomes almost impossible for them to be challenged by political parties or influenced by the philosophy. Eventually, such an executive or bureaucracy is liable to degenerate into a vested interest, and it either becomes corrupt, inflexibly and inefficiently bureaucratic, or simply tyrannical. I cannot resist the temptation to parody a paragraph by Marx on money power by substituting status in the bureaucratic hierarchy. It would go like this: my power is as great as the power of my status. The attributes and essential strength of status are those of myself, its owner. It is not my own personality which decides what I am and what I can do. I may be ugly, but I can coerce the prettiest woman alive. Consequently, I am not ugly, since status destroys the repellent power of ugliness. I may be lame, but my status entitles me to a car. Therefore, I am not lame. I may be bad, dishonest, ruthless, and narrow-minded, but status ensures respect for itself and its possessor. Status is the supreme good, and the man who has it must be good also. Thomas Jefferson put it rather more shortly. Whenever a man has cast a longing eye on offices, a rottenness begins in his conduct. The danger of any system in which the three factors are not in balance is that any limits to interference in the legitimate activities of private citizens and institutions have to be self-imposed by some conscious recognition of the needs of individuals and what are deemed to be their rights. Such limits can only be conceived by people who are convinced of the primary importance of the liberty of individuals and are prepared to accept that each one is entitled to his own point of view and his own freedom of action and expression within an objective law. The ambition for or the acquisition of dominant power by any one factor is obviously incompatible with this concept. In the ordinary course of events, the eventual popular reaction to an unbalanced acquisition of power is a more or less violent revolution. Such revolutions, in most cases against overpowerful executives, have taken place in almost all the major nations in the Northern Hemisphere as well as elsewhere. The first was in Britain in 1642, followed by the USA in 1777 and France in 1789, the USSR in 1917 and Germany in 1918. In each case, the eventual outcome was a completely reorganized general system of government. In Britain, the system evolved into a parliamentary democracy. It is perhaps worth noting that it was originally based on three estates, the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons, under a constitutional monarchy. For my purpose, the Lords Temporal and Commons constitute a single political estate, but the point is that the inclusion of the Church suggests that the value of a philosophy as a counterbalance to purely pragmatic political ambition or absolute executive power has been very well understood in this country for many years. It could be argued that with the relative decline in the influence of the Lords Spiritual, the balance of our system has been disturbed. The U.S. Constitution emerged from a war of independence rather than from an internal social revolution followed by a dictatorship, as in the other cases. The Founding Fathers were liberals and Democrats, and many were devout Christians, and they were living in what was still a pioneering community without an entrenched ecclesiastical or military establishment, or the deeply ingrained social structures of the old world. They were able, therefore, to take full advantage of this unique opportunity to start all over again. And in the end, they created a system based firmly on Christian philosophy, a democratic political structure, and a controlled administration which has stood the test of time, a civil and 2 world wars, and an astonishing rate of economic growth, without demanding more than a bare minimum of the sacrifice of personal liberty. This system is now so deeply entrenched that the only apparent aspect is the jockeying for political power between 2 groups of professional opponents, both of which are equally intent on controlling the executive and the administration through the system of checks and balances incorporated in the Constitution. After several false starts, Germany has finally adopted a similar system, and let us hope that it proves as successful and enduring as that of the United States. The French seem to have experienced the longest period of post-revolutionary instability, but thanks to the Napoleonic influence on the administrative structure and the reorganization of the Constitution in the 1960s, she is at last enjoying a period of considerable success and stability. With these 3 examples, it's rather tempting to speculate whether the USSR is going to repeat the pattern of revolution and dictatorship, leading eventually to a more liberal and tolerant system. In primitive societies, the purpose of, or the objective of the community was dictated by circumstances, and in most cases was simply the need to survive under the conditions prevailing. It might involve nothing more complicated than the choice of a leader to organize a hunting party or defense against attack. The circumstances may change, such as the transition from an agrarian to an industrial society, and the purpose may become more complicated or ambitious, such as the establishment of a system based on an intellectual theory, as in communism. But the need for a process of decision-making and the need for some sort of organization to manage cooperative activity remains the same. Naturally, these also have to evolve and adapt to changing demands and circumstances. I need hardly add that those groups or nations who manage to organize themselves most effectively, whether they are endowed with natural resources or not, are the most likely to be productive, peaceful, and prosperous. A wealth of natural resources may allow more mistakes and inefficiency, but they certainly do not guarantee a fair political system or an efficient administration. Neither is there any convincing evidence that even the most ambitious political philosophy or any divinely inspired religious doctrine can, of themselves, prevent an administration becoming a lumbering and oppressive bureaucracy. To oversimplify rather drastically, where politicians are concerned about what ought to be done and administrators are concerned with what can be done, it seems to me that philosophers are concerned with ideologies, explanations of history, and theories to account for human thoughts and actions, and the conclusions derived from them. In other words, the purpose for doing something. Philosophy therefore establishes either directly or by implication the ground rules for the game of life. Those who understand the arguments and are convinced that the conclusions are good ones, or at least that they are conveniently desirable from their own point of view, then set about devising an interpretation of these conclusions in terms of their practical application to organized human life. It is as if the philosophers had concluded that playing games appeared to allow the best chance for mankind to fulfill itself, or to redeem itself, or for whatever reason happens to strike them at the time. Those who are convinced by these ideas, who for simplicity might be described as the politicians, then have a debate about whether the people are most likely to be uplifted by sports of their own choice, or whether, say, a team-type game like football or an individual-type game like golf would be more appropriate. Meanwhile, the people would probably much rather enjoy drinking, smoking, and watching television. But no matter, the proper interpretation of the philosophy demands that golf should be played. The politicians having decided on the rules of the chosen game, the administrator is employed to get on and arrange it, whereupon he designs the courses and provides the officials in the form of judges, umpires, and referees to see that the rules are complied with. He arranges for coaches, matches, and championships, and all the other tiresome details that finally make it possible for the individual to benefit, or otherwise, from the wisdom of the philosopher. Unfortunately, human nature being what it doesn't take long for the more competitive or enterprising players to discover loopholes in the rules, or for officials to lose their impartiality. So, once again, the politicians are required to amend the rules and to keep a stricter eye on the officials. Experience in the control and administration of sports and games is that, in the interests of fairness and impartiality, the people who write the rules and those who act as officials are not permitted to take part in the game at the same time. The same, unfortunately, cannot be said for some forms of government. In some systems, the whole game, apart from a few caddies, has been taken over by the state. In other systems, the term mixed economy means that the ordinary players find that both politicians and administrators are taking part both as players as well as referees. Meanwhile, the philosopher, whose whole idea it was, is inclined to be forgotten. History seems to suggest that this sort of relationship between philosophy, politics, and administration is present in all the ancient and indeed in all the modern civilizations. However, history is also full of examples of good intentions going wrong. I rather doubt whether the early Marxists ever imagined that their doctrine would lead to Stalin's tyranny over the Soviet Union. And just listen to what Marx had to say about censorship of the press. A censored press is a thing without a backbone, a vampire of slavery, a civilized monstrosity, a scented freak of nature. Is there any further need to prove that freedom is in accordance with the essence of the press, and that censorship is contrary to it? But then, to be fair, I suppose you could say that the Inquisition was bad luck on St. Paul. The fact is that the success of a tolerant, liberal system depends to a large extent on a general acceptance of standards of human behavior, which recognizes the need for social discipline by everyone within an ordered framework, but which are based on a philosophy of personal responsibility. But it is exactly this general acceptance by voluntary means which is so difficult to achieve. In any homogeneous organization or institution with one single and obvious purpose, the problem is not too difficult. In essence, it comprises two parts: the selection of leaders or policy and decision-makers, and the development of an administrative structure designed to execute policy decisions. In practice, it usually happens that both the policymakers and the administrators are practicing members of the organization itself, who are selected by one process or another to undertake the political management of the affairs of their organization as an extra chore. The major Christian churches and universities are good examples of this type of internal self-management carried on simultaneously with their primary operational purposes. Universities are, of course, particularly fortunate as they are unique among all institutions in that they are controlled entirely by students and ex-students. This system of internal self-government is a simple and genuine form of democracy, and it is the usual method of managing every kind of institution in this country, from Trinity House to the Stock Exchange, but with the notable exception of such relatively recent institutions which have come to be known as quangos, or quasi-autonomous government organizations, whose members are appointed by patronage and from which the element of representative self-government and accountability has been virtually excluded. The self-government of institutions is a vital element in any society which aspires to be democratic, and furthermore it has a great advantage in that it allows governments to concentrate on the business for which only governments can be responsible. While it is perfectly true that a bad management structure can inhibit the establishment of harmonious human relations and consequently prevent sensible decisions being taken, even the very best management structure cannot hope to work without the will to make it work. And human nature being what it is, the will to make a system work is always stronger where the interests of individuals are coincident, or at least compatible, with the interests of the system as a whole. As Marx put it, the purpose of the true state is not that each citizen should devote himself to the general cause as though to a particular one, but that the general cause should be truly general, i.e. the cause of every citizen. This precept applies to every system of government, where even the most rational and realistic political structures can be rendered utterly meaningless if ambitious and unscrupulous politicians and administrators are tempted to exploit the system in their interest, rather than to make it work for the purpose for which it was intended. It also applies, in a rather different sense, to organizations intended to produce goods or services. These cannot function successfully unless there is a sensible structure, an accepted standard of behavior, and a general will to cooperate within that structure to achieve the objective. And as this cooperation needs to take place between people of all kinds of talents and qualities, the will to cooperate is absolutely vital. Philosophers and political scientists over the ages have concerned themselves, amongst other things, with such imponderables as justice, equity, morality, and the rights and responsibilities of the individual and the purpose of governments. There have been many different schools of thought, some emphasizing one aspect and some another, but in the end, it seems to be possible to divide them into two broad camps. Again, to oversimplify, one camp concentrates on reason and logic. It talks about mankind and humanity and generalizes man into a sort of universal substance. To take the analogy with Goff a stage further, it might be said that the utopia of the mankind camp is a situation where a benevolent state arranges for everyone to score a hole-in-one at each attempt, regardless of cost. The other camp concentrates on the individual and on his total nature and believes that the whole value of the game is the constant striving for perfection and the personal satisfaction to be gained by individual improvement. The division of attitude among philosophers has been developing over many centuries. It might be argued that one stream of thought has come down through Plato and in the main through European thinkers, culminating in the Hegelians and Marx. It seems to have started out with the supposition that human existence on Earth could achieve an ideal state simply by the operation of reasoned thought, and that once all men came to recognize the advantages of a system created by pure reason, they would naturally and obviously accept the situation, although it is not always clear exactly who is to decide what is reasonable and rational for everyone beyond any dispute. In this argument, mankind as a whole is treated as if it were some sort of sentient being with a lifespan covering the whole of human existence. Consequently, mankind is thought capable of reacting as a whole and gradually growing in wisdom, understanding, and brotherly love, with an idealized state as the instrument for achieving this ideal situation. This stream of thought has inclined to the view that it is only the state, inspired by reasonable and rational intelligence, that can decide what is good for its people, and what and how they should do and think.